Let's jump right in. The intro. So in the intro, Bell Hooks basically talks about her experience in the world and talking about race as a woman, some observations she sees about women, and talk about race. And big idea there is that it's like a male-dominated space. A big part of me wishes I had no idea what she was talking about there, and that since this book was written in, or a lot of these essays were written in the 90s or around that time, I really wish I was like, oh my gosh, we're in 2025. That's one of those things where I'm like, we just don't relate. But unfortunately, I think it's very similar to what we see now. And I think this tactic of when you hear a woman start to speak about race, and then maybe this woman then starts to talk about intersectional lens of race, talks about race and gender and class and how those things come together to impact life, impact society, then all of a sudden we're no longer talking about race. We're talking about something else. We're talking about, now you're talking about feminism, you're talking about gender, we're talking about race, right? And that tactic is a very similar tactic to what I see, and something that I try to point out in my Intro to Philosophy videos of, oh, when white people talk about these topics and themes, then that's acknowledged as philosophy, right? That's acknowledged as metaphysics, epistemology, value theory, right? Like that's what this stuff is. But then when a black or brown person talks about it, it's something else. It's sociology, it's history, it's not philosophy. And I find that annoying. I think that it is unjust. I think that it is problematic, to say the least. And it's funny how that similar tactic is used in this context of gender. At least that's how I interpret the scenario. When I read it, that's what I think of. That's what I get reminded of, is all of a sudden, oh, wait a minute. Isn't the same thing we see over here with race? And now we're taking this tactic in the space where we have people of the same race and we're using it against women. So it's just funny because you have these hierarchies and this power dynamic, this hegemonic system, and it just tracks and keeps following because people have a hard time dismantling hierarchy and actually challenging that. And so basically, right, there's this idea she's observing and seeing play out where men aren't respecting the women in the space of talking about race. Women themselves are censoring because they don't want to be seen as less feminine or less sexy. White women aren't engaging in it because they're supposed to be real sexy. All these gender dynamics playing themselves out in the space of talking about race, that's really interesting. Now we start off talking about this in this book. Why? Is this book about feminism? Let me be clear. Bell Hooks is self-described as a feminist, radical feminist. And in that meaning, not just abiding by status quo, for being very critical of status quo through a principle of equity. And this book is not about feminism. It's about race. And if you read this intro and you're like, oh my gosh, this is a feminist book, you're actually falling into part of that trap that Hooks is trying to talk about, where it's like, oh, if I then try and contextualize and say, oh, this feminist principle or these things from this space are also relevant to the conversation, now all of a sudden it's a feminist thing. That's not what's happening here. Not that that should offend you or turn you off, by the way, because you're not even gonna go there today. We're just not gonna do it. But what I'm trying to note and describe to you all is that if you're hearing this, you're like, oh my gosh, this is a feminist book. It's actually not. It's a race book that has feminist concerns, but we're talking about race and racism. The intro starts this way because I think what Hooks wants us to understand is that part of what's going to be required to end racism is a full contextual view of what the heck is going on. And in order to have that full contextual view, there's certain considerations that need to be respected and valued that traditionally are not done. So what are some of the main things I really want to take out of the intro is just setting the tone there of these considerations that are often left out of the conversation that should be better heard and respected and seen. I think in comparison to the 90s to now, I think that women are heard as being about race and it not being necessarily seen as something else or dismissed. But I will say that I'm not totally unfamiliar to what that looks and sounds like to see a woman dismissed and trying to talk about race. And then especially if they're trying to talk about race from an intersectional point of view, oh my gosh, the walls that go up I have seen in my own life with my own two eyes. It's kind of saddening. I think that in terms of this first sentence where she says, when race and racism are the topic in public discourse, the voices that speak are male. I think that has shifted a bit, but I don't think it shifted nearly enough from where we come from in this book to where we are now. I just don't think that's happened enough. That's where I'm at. I kind of know what you all think. What do you all think? Do you think that when it comes to talking about race and racism that women do have a voice? Is this totally unfamiliar terrain now? How do you see this showing up? What are your reactions to that? How do you think things have changed? Another couple things I wanted to just point out before we move on to the next chapter. One is this term race talk. Race talk is a term that she gets from Toni Morrison to talk about this insertion into our daily lives, this idea and this imagery that blacks are at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. Specifically, she says that race talk, the explicit insertion into everyday life of racial signs and symbols that have no meaning other than pressing African Americans to the lowest level of racial hierarchy. Although we have racism and race talk showing up all over the place, there's still a space of denial. And in that denial, it's a tool for keeping white supremacy and racism alive. Let me see. There's another piece where she talks about denial is in fact a cornerstone of white European culture and has been called out by the major critical voices who speak to, for, and from the location of whiteness. Marx, Freud, Foucault. After all, if we pretend racism does not exist, that we do not know what it is or how to change it, it never has to go away. So she goes on to talk about really clear racial discrimination is not fashionable like it used to be. And that's why everybody can pretend that racism doesn't exist. So we have to shift how we talk about racism. And the reason I wanted to point all this out is because I think this is another place where, again, we differ a little bit. I feel like in the 90s, all the way up until Obama was president, we were like in this space of racism doesn't exist. We're all one people. There's some things that happen, but we're not talking about those. Racism is dying or it's dead. And then Obama gets in office and a lot of stuff starts going down. We start having more clear conversations about police violence. Well, we were already having conversations about that, but I don't know. I just feel like the culture kind of shifted because there's a black president in office and all of these racist things were still happening. And we're hoping and pleading for this black president to do something and shift the dynamic of America and not have these things continue to happen. And they're still continuing to happen with a black man in the presidential office. Wild. Now, Obama did do some things. Obama is the reason that we have police cameras. Amazing, right? He did some things to help shift our culture, but the culture is still racist, right? We're still living this thing, baby. And after Obama gets out of office, right, there's a lot of white backlash. As he's in office and after he's out of office, there's just a lot of backlash. And here we are now. And we've had people in our highest of office say some very racist things, and just it is what it is right now. We have some groups of people who are being targeted because of their racial and ethnic backgrounds. And I just feel like today you cannot get away with saying that racism doesn't exist. I think some people still try and shape a narrative of, oh, you're just whining. Oh, no, this isn't a race thing. This is a lazy thing. Or this is just the typical narrative still exists. But I think it's a lot harder to deny racism post-Obama. That's where I stand on that. I don't know what you all think. I just feel like that's a shift. And I think racism gets called out a lot more and a lot more clearly these days. If you just look at all these conversations and these tensions all over the place right now in our culture and our society, there's a lot of talk about racism and how it's showing its ugly head. And so many different aspects of our society, things are being called out and being held accountable on one end, and then things are just going out of control and still being called out on the other end. And we're in some wild times right now. So that was something I took a note for. Just things have changed a little bit. Overt racism also being fashionable. I don't know, Rose. Looking like that's hitting up a comeback. When you have your president saying some things that are racist and he gets reelected, I just feel like, isn't that a sign of it being fashionable again? Anyway, so then we go into talking about we need a counter-hegemonic race talk from everybody. So hegemony is a term to talk about hierarchy and power dynamics within that hierarchy. I'm actually gonna do the specific definition of hegemony. I've heard it both ways, but I'm gonna let you all explicit definition because I think it's important to refresh our memories or to implant in our memories definitions of some of these terms so we don't lose what the intention is behind the sentence. So hegemony refers to the dominance of one group, state, or entity over others, often characterized by political, cultural, or economic power, right? So again, We talk about, when I say hierarchy, system of top to bottom power. And hegemony, let me see how Google actually pronounces it. I was right. Hegemony. I've also heard hegemony. Oh, you can also say hegemony. I'm looking at the pronunciation breakdown. Anyway, hegemony is to refer to somebody controlling somebody else. So when Hooks talks about we need counter-hegemonic race talk, Hooks is saying we need talk against this power over another group that is also defined by like these racist tropes. Specifically, we need talk against this system that puts black people at the bottom. We need to talk against white supremacy. Now here's the thing. That's not to say we need to fight the whites. I don't know why people always go there. White supremacy is not necessarily tied to people who are white people. You being white and living in a system of white supremacy means that you get certain privileges and standing in that system, and there's a certain amount of responsibility and benefits that you get from being of that status, whether you want to or not. But like, it doesn't mean that you're evil or that you have to participate in that by means of like trying to. I don't know. I just feel it's weird when people like, oh, this is attack on white people. Like, no, it's not. You don't have to be part of the problem. You can actually take a part in a hold and not being part of the problem. And that's part of what Hooks is getting into in this book as well. That actually takes us into our next essay that I'm about to jump into. But before I do, I just want to talk about again. She says we need counter-hegemonic race talk from everybody. So racism isn't just non-white folks' problem, right? It's not just their problem. It's also white people's problem. Everybody needs to get on board to talk against this system, because the system is involving everybody and it's hurting everybody. So we all have to be involved in dismantling it. The last thing I want to talk about from the intro is this point where she talks about men say racism will never end, and in the feminist space that it's very much more hopeful and optimistic. And I thought that was really interesting, but just again, coming from the fact that we were just talking about Afro-pessimism and racial permanence, and this idea that racism will never end with racial permanence, and that society depends on black subjugation, Afro-pessimism, right? And so if you want to get rid of racism, you'd have to totally dismantle society, Afro-pessimism. I thought that was really interesting because we just talked about some of the men that had that tone and understanding about racism. And then here we are with Hook saying, whoa, we actually can end racism? In the feminist space, we're a lot more hopeful and optimistic about this. And then she says in this writing, that serves as part of this narrative too, where like we can do something about racism. And I wanted to read, go back to page 6. I testify in this writing. Bear witness to the reality that our many cultures can be remade, that this nation can be transformed, that we can resist racism, and in the act of resistance, recover ourselves and be renewed. So I just think that that's a really important stance to take. I'm really interested to just hear the difference between how Hooks approaches dealing with racism versus somebody like a Derek Bell. I'm just kind of intrigued by hearing the difference in tone about racism there across these gendered perspectives, apparently. So I think this is a really cool introduction. I was just like, ooh, here we go, I'm getting excited.